Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to Christianly. This is your host, Brad Andrews. As always, thanks for joining us for this week's edition of the podcast. This podcast exists to cultivate holy courage in you, and we do that by attempting to look at issues in our culture that are really happening right now through a biblical worldview so that you can grow in your confidence to stand firm on God's truth. And we do it this way each week. We actually look at 3 different issues together that I think are really important for you to know about, to sort of understand, but also consider what your response to those issues might be. We do a deep dive into one issue, and sandwiched around that deep dive, we look at 2 other issues that are a little shorter in length. And the goal is to try to keep this about 30 minutes or so that your time is worth it as you listen to this. It's something that you can digest and enjoy. So let's jump right in. Issue number 1. What happens when a medical system designed to heal children discovers that those same children can become lifelong customers? A new HHS report alleges that money and questionable billing practices have come together in a system that may have made vulnerable kids profitable.
Hey everybody, this is Vice President J.D. Vance. I'm here with my friends and colleagues, of course, our great Health and Human Services Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and Admiral Brian Christine, the Assistant Secretary for Health. Parents bring their children to doctors because they trust them. They trust doctors to tell them the truth, and they trust hospitals to put their children ahead of ideology and profit. But when that trust gets violated, parents deserve to have a government that will stand up for them and for their kids and do something about it. Today, the Trump administration is proud to announce we're doing exactly that.
Today, HHS released Wolves in White Coats, a report examining pediatric gender medicine and insurance building across America. The findings raise serious questions about what families were told, what insurers were told, and how these procedures were built.
In the clip that you just heard, Vice President J.D. Vance and Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy, alongside Dr. Brian Christine, who is the Assistant Secretary for Health, announced a report that came out last week that could have been the title of a horror movie. The title of the report was Wolves in White Coats. I remember when I first heard it, I thought, surely that can't be right, but it is. And in short, the report accuses hospitals and medical providers of using financial incentives and, in some cases, potentially fraudulent billing practices to push gender-related treatments on minors. Now, at this point, the information in the report are just allegations. They're just investigative findings. But the HHS says that in this report, the billing patterns really demand an investigation. And so the Justice Department and the HHS Inspector General have been charged as to look at this report and figure out whether these providers have actually committed fraud. Here's the deal. Even if a portion of what they uncovered here is true, we're looking at something that is absolutely horrid. And as we've said on this podcast before, we are looking into the face of a medical system that has turned vulnerable children into customers and profit. Now, the first thing that this report exposes is the money issue. According to HHS, more than 225 hospitals and health systems established pediatric gender programs, and estimates come to nearly $120 million that have been charged for sex-rejecting procedures on minors since the year 2019. And it doesn't stop there. A child who receives those puberty blockers or hormones or surgery may require ongoing care, years of visits and testing and prescriptions, not to mention the mental health appointments, even additional procedures, sometimes to correct the ongoing problems with the surgeries. In other words, a patient can become, as we just said, a recurring customer. But the report alleges something even darker. The money was sometimes obtained through the manipulation of the system itself. And here's what that means. In the report, HHS identified roughly $50 million in claims for puberty blockers, but they were billed under the diagnosis code E34.9, which is the endocrine disorder unspecified, rather than gender dysphoria, for example. It also identified nearly $11 million in claims for teenagers ages 13 through 17 billed under precocious puberty, a diagnosis that ordinarily is given to those with an abnormally early onset of puberty. If it is found out that either of those things are true, that's not just oversight, that is fraud. As we've reported on this podcast before, we've already seen a concrete example of this that happened even before this report was released. Texas Children's Hospital agreed to a $10 million settlement over allegations involving Medicaid billing for transgender procedures. And that's the money issue, but that is only one part of the story. The second part really is the ideology part. The HHS report also says that pediatric gender medicine was not just this collection of doctors independently responding to children with supposed medical and psychological challenges. It actually describes these institutions themselves being captured by a worldview where gender identity was the controlling category through which they interpreted almost all of the challenges that these kids had related to their gender. Maybe I could say it this way. Instead of doctors asking to these children and parents, what is happening to this child? They were asking, how do we affirm what this child says is already happening? See, that's not care. That is actually confirmation of confusion. And the report also contains stories to that end from detransitioners who say that that is exactly what happened to them. Clementine Breen says that she was diagnosed with gender dysphoria at the age of 7 and was steered toward irreversible treatments. Layla Jane says that she received testosterone and a double mastectomy at the age of 13. And Soren Aldeko alleges that her trauma history was actually dismissed by the doctors she came to for care, and that a surgical referral later described her history falsely. Now, those are just anecdotes, but they are the stories that we should not be afraid to hear. And really, here is my problem with all of this. Again, it's one we've talked about before on Christianly. For years, we have been told that this was settled science. And anyone who questioned those in the medical field that were giving this, quote, care, were promoting this ideology, well, we were accused of being bigoted and anti-science. But the reality is that the science was never settled, not been settled, even if the activist doctors wanted to pretend that it was. In fact, we have things like the Cass Review, which was published by the NHS of England in 2024, that found evidence supporting that these kinds of interventions for children did not work. So we have to ask a very serious question. As another example in the Wolves and White Coats report, as it's been released, what if the people who claim to be on the side of compassion were actually in it for themselves and not for the children? And because of that, have permanently damaged the very children that they claim to protect. See, if these allegations are true, then the scandal around it is not just that some doctors may have broken the rules, is that there is a subculture within the medical community that is claiming to empower children, when in reality, it was a profit scheme that benefited their own wallets. Friends, that is not compassion, as we've just said. That is actually exploitation of the worst kind. And now for our deep dive issue number 2. What happens when an institution devoted to the pursuit of truth becomes so committed to a particular narrative that when you start to question that narrative, it becomes suspect by others? The tragic story of Cambridge professor Jason Arday gives us, I think, a window into what happens when identity and ideology and institutional prestige collide.
Now, it should go without saying that Arday's death is a terrible tragedy that no one should be celebrating. At the same time, it's true to say that this tragedy was enabled by the psychological need among white liberal elites for a black avatar of their guilt. Arday's death should be a call for liberals and progressives to look inward, not to expunge the supposed demon of white supremacy that lives inside their hearts, but to look at the nature of white guilt itself, because ultimately, white guilt is a virus which leads its victims to prioritize their own need for catharsis over the public's need for truth. The moment that society's elites have this much-needed epiphany en masse will be the moment that we ensure the tragic case of Jason Arday never repeats itself.
Back in July of this year, philosopher Nathan Kofnes, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Ghent University in Belgium, published an article raising questions about the academic record of a sociology professor by the name of Jason Arday, who at the time was working at the historic University of Cambridge, which is about 60 miles north of London. And the reports, more specifically, alleged that Arday had plagiarized portions of his doctoral work, and so journalists and academics began to examine those claims based on his article, and that led to even more investigations into things like Arday's charitable contributions, elements of his personal story, even his athletic feats like running marathons. Now, Cambridge first defended him. They said that the criticism was a campaign to undermine Arday's credibility. But after the questions continued to mount, the university said, "We will do an investigation and look into Arday's qualifications." Unfortunately, before they could finish their investigation, Arday resigned on August the 5th. Now, why this story initially became such a cultural flashpoint was that Arday had been appointed by Cambridge in 2023 to his position at the age of 37, which meant that he was the university's youngest Black professor ever. And at the time of his appointment, his rise to that role was presented as a man who had overcome many obstacles, developmental challenges, and now had entered academia and had reached one of the most prestigious chairs in Britain. But the story does not end with his resignation. Also, unfortunately, 9 days later, after Arday stepped down from his post, he was found dead at the age of 41. Now, the Metropolitan Police described his death as unexpected, but not suspicious. And at the time of this podcast, the cause and the manner of his death have not been publicly established. Now, as you can imagine, because of the timing of his resignation and his death, there has been much speculation on many fronts. And one of those things that has happened has been the question of who is to blame. So what should we do with that question? Where did this tragic story go wrong, and who or what is to blame? Now, I think the deeper issue with this story is not even Jason Arday. It's a collision of cultures that made this story possible. And I want to walk through three things that I think have contributed to this. The first is DEI. Now, for the uninitiated, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, DEI is a framework that seeks to first promote diversity of representation. That's the D. Second, it desires an equity of outcome. That is the E. And finally, it's pursuing an inclusion of people who are considered underrepresented. That is the I. Now, in practice, DEI has been utilized often as a way to hire or admit people to college institutions or even professorships based on those categories instead of things like merit and qualification. And that's where the Arday story comes into play. See, Cambridge did not merely announce that it had hired an accomplished sociologist when they hired Arday. At the time, it celebrated the fact that he was, as we just said, the youngest Black professor in the university's history. In other words, his racial identity was what was important for the institution to communicate to the larger culture. Now, if a university said, "We hired this man because he is an outstanding scholar," I think the natural response to that would be to say, "Well, tell us about his academic acumen." But if a university says what Cambridge said, which is, "We hired this man and this is historically significant because he is Black," that I think gives us an opportunity to think about something else. Why is his race a part of his qualification for the appointment? In his recent article on the Arday situation in First Things, Daryl Paul, who himself is an assistant professor at Williams College in Massachusetts, said that the contemporary academy, the university, places like the University of Cambridge, has become preoccupied with things like DEI and what it represents. And Paul would know he's in that culture. But he says that a culture like that creates a market for people like Arday, and those markets create incentives. So let's think about this. So if institutions want representatives from a certain class of people that they deem underrepresented, they will look for those representatives, will they not? And then once you create incentives for people to present themselves in ways that would satisfy those categories, well, it creates a culture where those same individuals will cater their identities, even to the point of absurdity, to gain entrance into those institutions. Which brings us to the second thing that I think we need to think about as we consider the Arday story. And it really is this: the problem of white guilt. I have seen this in particular play itself out in the Christian community quite a bit. People who overcorrect and begin treating racial guilt as motivation to almost always see themselves through the category of being the oppressor. And the problem with that is that it creates its own form of partiality. And here's what I mean. They would condemn judging people by the color of their skin, while developing a system, an ideology that does exactly that. So let's apply this to the academy since we're talking about our day here. Let's say a black scholar makes a claim about a racial discrimination that's happening against him, and the claim is accepted because he claims to have had lived experience related to this. Then a white scholar questions that claim. I wonder if you see the trap. The accusation contains its own defense, and if you disagree, your disagreement proves the accusation. That isn't scholarship. That is a closed system. Interestingly enough, Carl Trueman, also a professor, Christian professor, in a follow-up article to Paul's article, tells a story that he brought an obvious case of plagiarism before an academic standards committee at the college he worked at, and the committee began questioning Trueman about whether his decision to pursue this case, if it was racially motivated. Now, that is anecdotal as well, but more true than we would maybe want to admit. This is where the white guilt becomes destructive in the academy. See, once you have convinced people that their racial identity carries a presumption of guilt, you create another system in which some people are automatically presumed credible because of their race. And that's dangerous because that means others are automatically presumed suspect. I think that is Coleman Hughes' point in the clip that you heard at the top of this segment. And that really brings us to the last issue that I want to talk about with this Arday situation. The modern university was supposed to be a place where truth is pursued without certain ideas and narratives being protected at all costs. In that same article by Trueman in First Things, he says that the deeper problem is the therapeutic conception of truth in the university system. And here's what he means by that. Traditional truth says reality is what is, and we must then conform ourselves to that. But therapeutic truth says reality must be interpreted in a way that affirms the self. And that is when academic standards really become negotiable, when they threaten the preferred narrative of a person. And the result is that the university is no longer asking students to discover what is true. Instead, it's teaching them only those truths that they are permitted to wrestle with. And that is not education. See, the trouble with all of this is that the university has, by all accounts, abandoned the idea that truth exists, particularly that it exists independent of our desires. I think DEI is an example of that collapse. White guilt is another. And what we really see in all of this is that once God is removed from one's thinking, something else will always fill the vacuum. And the modern university has filled that vacuum with a mix of identity and power, along with a healthy dose of therapeutic affirmation and institutional prestige. And that is why Arday's story is so telling, and I think why it's hit a nerve. The shock of his story is not just that a professor may have misrepresented aspects of his past. It is that an institution, again, whose business should be the pursuit of truth, that it actually required a public scandal before it would begin to ask basic questions about one of its most celebrated appointments who bent the truth. And tragically, what we see in this story is that a university that sacrifices truth to protect people that they believe should be protected, it will eventually protect its own project at the expense of the people it actually claims to protect. And now issue number 3. For years, Mike Pence was held up as the picture of principled conservatism, the polite, respectable, Christian, measured man. But what if the problem with that model is not that it was too conservative, but that it taught Christians, and particularly Christian men, to keep their own noses clean while the culture burned down around them?
It was a profound moment for me. I mean, obviously, I wasn't ignorant of his public positions, and I will say I don't know what's in his heart and what his deepest beliefs are. I just knew that through the last year before that, through traveling around the world with him, he had treated me with dignity and respect, and had been an amazing PDB customer, really, really effective in giving me that experience that I'd always wanted. And here he was with my mom, who had had an enormously difficult time with my transition just many years before, and Mike Pence is affirming my gender identity. And I thought we made it. What more could I possibly ask for but that? And it really felt like, no matter what setbacks we could suffer, at least for me, I felt like we were there. And these two dreams that I'd had since I was a kid of being a CIA officer and this unexplainable dream of being a woman could coexist in the same universe.
Actually, yesterday, a tweet from Katie Miller, who is the wife of Stephen Miller, who is currently the White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy and the United States Homeland Security Advisor, went viral. In it was a screenshot from an Atlantic article by Julia Curley, a biological male who claims to be transgender, but also was a former CIA officer who served under 4 presidencies and 3 wars and worked in the White House during the first Trump administration. The quote came from an article entitled "The Wrong Kind of American." The subtitle was "The Trump White House Needed Me Until the Fact That I Am Trans Became Public." Here was the quote that was screenshot by Miller. It said, "No one has affirmed my gender identity quite like Mike Pence. On my last day, I gave him a letter and I wrote, I'm a transgender CIA officer, a wife and mother, and I served the vice president. Anything is possible in America. I told him many people at the CIA hadn't believed that a trans officer like me could serve someone like him. Well, he said, I'm glad I passed the test." And don't miss the quote, "No one has affirmed my gender identity quite like Mike Pence." That is quite a sentence, is it not? Now, why do I say that? Well, if your ideological opponents can walk away from your kindness and think that you have affirmed their worldview, it is highly likely that you have confused being winsome with being clear. There's a phrase that the right has used to describe itself at times. It's a phrase called principled conservatism. And Mike Pence was, and maybe still is to some extent, the poster child for this idea. There was a time when many conservatives, including myself, looked at a man like Pence and thought that is what conservatism is supposed to look like. But we need to be honest about whether that's true or not. I want to give you an example from Pence's record that preceded his vice presidency. In 2015, as governor of Indiana, Pence signed the state's Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and within days, he and other Indiana lawmakers agreed to amend the law to make clear that it could not be used as a defense for refusing services to gay customers. At the time, the Family Research Council criticized the amendment, arguing that the revision would weaken the law's protection for religious liberty. Now, reasonable Christians can debate the prudence of that particular legislation, like what the best way to protect religious liberty in a pluralistic society looks like. But the larger pattern is worth noticing, in my opinion. For years, a lot of the Republican establishment told conservatives that principles were the foundation of the movement. Yet when those principles collided with pressures from other places, corporations, media, cultural elites, other kinds of institutions, many times those principles became remarkably flexible, like we saw in the story we just told you. That is why the nostalgia to return to some golden age of principled conservatism should be treated with some caution here in our day. There have been good men in conservatism. There are good principles in theory within conservatism. There have even been some important victories, but we need to face up to something. The old Christian political model has often emphasized niceness while neglecting courage. Another way to say this would be, whatever you do, don't make anybody uncomfortable. And what that produces, particularly for men who can, again, keep their own noses clean, is a head in the sand approach while the culture around them is really struggling. So when someone says, let's return to principled conservatism, I think the response from Christian men in particular should be this question: which principles? And will you actually stand on them when standing on them costs you something? Because a principle that only exists when it's popular, that's not a principle. And this is why Curley's statement about Pence in that screenshot is a window into, I think, a failure of a certain kind of Christian conservatism. She walked away from that relationship believing that Pence had, at best, looked the other way, but at worst, affirmed her identity. And whether Pence intended to communicate that or not, that is what she experienced. So that should cause us to ask whether our pursuit of being liked sometimes comes at the expense of being clear. See, I think Christians are called to make peace, not with falsehood in order to preserve our reputation, but actually be the kind of people like Jesus who are full of grace and truth. And if we're going to call ourselves, quote, principled, then our principles must be strong enough to survive whatever moment we're in when the culture demands that we compromise those same principles. The church does not need another generation or two or three of Christians who are merely nice enough to just be liked by the culture. We actually need Christians and Christian politicians as well who are humble enough to, yes, love their neighbors, but courageous enough to tell those same neighbors the truth. We need Christians that are faithful enough to remember that the approval of Washington or the Atlantic or anyone else is a very cheap substitute for the approval of Christ. Hey, thanks again for joining us for this week's edition of the Christianly Podcast. I want to encourage you to connect with us. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us on social media. You see the options there at the bottom of your screen. Would love to connect with you there. And if you have questions for us or comments, we'd love to hear those. Be sure to follow us. Any way that you listen to us, make sure you get notifications for new episodes. We would love that. And if you're ever in the Tulsa area, I would love to invite you to come and join us at Cross and Crown Church, where I have the privilege to be the lead pastor there. We meet at Will Rogers Church at 10:30 on Sunday mornings. We'd love to have you, get to know you there. And remember, don't just speak and lead, share the light. And remember that there isn't a corner of this world that doesn't belong to the King.